Canada just walked out on the biggest economic relationship in human history. 75 years of partnership, trillions in trade, gone. And the moment it ended, 14 nations were already on the phone. This isn't a political opinion. This isn't media spin. This is a financial earthquake. And the aftershocks are going to be felt in Detroit, in Texas, in your supermarket aisle, and in your retirement portfolio. So if you've been sleeping on this story, wake up right now. Because what just happened between Canada and the United States will be studied in economics textbooks for the next 100 years. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that bell. Because the kind of analysis you're about to hear, you won't find it packaged like this anywhere else. Drop a comment below. Tell me, do you think America just made the biggest economic blunder of the 21st century? Let's get into it. To understand the scale of what just broke, you have to understand what the US-Canada relationship actually was. This wasn't just two neighbors trading hockey sticks and maple syrup. This was the most integrated economic partnership on the planet. Before this trade war ignited, the US and Canada were exchanging over $760 billion worth of goods and services every single year. That's more than $2 billion crossing that border. Every single day. The two economies were so deeply fused that a single car built in Detroit crossed the US-Canada border an average of 8 times before it was completed, picking up parts, assemblies, and components from both sides. That's not trade. That's a shared circulatory system. Canada was America's #1 export market. Not China, not the EU. Canada. American farmers, American steelworkers, American energy companies, all of them depended on Canadian demand. And on the other side, Canada sent 75% of everything it exported directly into the United States. 75%. That's not a trading relationship. That's economic dependency at a level most countries never reach. And for 75 years it worked. NAFTA deepened it, USMCA reinforced it. 2 generations of workers on both sides of that border built their livelihoods on the assumption that this partnership was permanent. Then Donald Trump reached for the tariff button. February 1st, 2025. President Trump signs executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on virtually all Canadian imports, with a slightly lower 10% rate carved out for Canadian energy. The justification? Border security, fentanyl, sovereignty concerns. But the economic reality was blunt and brutal. America just taxed its closest ally like an adversary. Canada didn't blink. Within hours, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced $30 billion worth of retaliatory tariffs on American goods, with a clear warning that it would escalate to $155 billion, roughly $106 billion USD, within 3 weeks if Washington didn't back down. Washington didn't back down. Then on March 26, 2025, Trump escalated further, announcing 25% tariffs on all imported vehicles and auto parts. This was the nuclear option. The automotive sector alone represents hundreds of thousands of jobs across Ontario and across American states like Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. These supply chains don't just overlap, they're the same supply chain. You can't surgically cut one side without amputating the other. That night, Canada held an emergency cabinet meeting in Ottawa. And what came out of that meeting changed everything. The next morning, Mark Carney, Canada's newly installed Prime Minister and former Governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, stood before cameras and delivered what can only be described as the economic equivalent of a funeral speech. The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over. Read that again. The Prime Minister of Canada, America's largest trading partner, declared the relationship over, not strained, not difficult, over. He didn't stop there. He told 41 million Canadians they needed to dramatically reduce their reliance on the United States. He said Canada would need to move at speeds we haven't seen in generations. He called Trump's tariffs a very direct attack. And in a line that should have dominated every financial headline on the planet, he said, "We are masters in our own home." This was not diplomatic language. This was a declaration of economic independence. Here's where it gets absolutely fascinating from a finance perspective, because Carney didn't just announce a breakup. He announced a replacement strategy, and it was already in motion before the press conference ended. Carney's first foreign trip as Prime Minister, he skipped Washington entirely. He flew to Paris, then London. Standing next to French President Emmanuel Macron, he said Canada must deepen trade and security ties with the democratic nations of Europe. Macron, for his part, called tariffs counterproductive, producing inflation and supply chain chaos. But the real move was bigger than bilateral summits. Behind closed doors, and this is the part most financial analysts missed, Canada was already spearheading talks to do something that had never been attempted before, linking the European Union with a 12-nation CPTPP and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Think about what that means. The CPTPP includes Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Mexico, Singapore, Malaysia, Chile, New Zealand, Peru, Brunei, the United Kingdom, and Canada itself. The EU brings in 27 more economies. Together, this proposed alliance would represent approximately 40% of global GDP and 1.5 billion consumers. For context, the entire US economy represents roughly 25% of global GDP. China sits around 18-20%. This wasn't a reaction. This was a coordinated strategic pivot that had been quietly engineered while Trump was still announcing tariffs on Truth Social. And in November 2025, the EU's Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic officially launched the first ever EU CPTPP trade and investment dialogue in Australia, covering trade diversification, digital commerce, supply chain resilience, and WTO reform. Officials from Brussels described their enthusiasm for the deal as being super keen. Japan confirmed interest in building supply chain resilience outside American influence. The architecture of a new global trade order was being assembled, and the United States had no seat at the table. So here's the question every American should be asking right now. If 40% of the global economy realigns away from the US dollar's trade dominance, what happens to American exports? What happens to American jobs? What happens to the price of everything in your home? That answer is coming, and it's not comfortable. Welcome back. If you just joined, go watch part 1 first, because what you're about to hear only makes sense if you understand the foundation. We just established that Canada declared the US-Canada relationship officially over, that Mark Carney flew to Paris instead of Washington, and that a coalition covering 40% of global GDP is actively being assembled, without American participation. Now comes the part that hits home, because this isn't just geopolitics. This is your paycheck, your mortgage, your grocery bill. This is what happens to the American economy when its single largest trading partner, the country buying more American goods than anyone else on earth, decides it no longer wants to be dependent on you. Comment below right now. Have you already felt price increases from this trade war? Tell me what's gone up in your area, because the data is about to confirm what your wallet already knows. Let's start with the sector that took the first bullet. And it wasn't Canada that fired it. It was Washington. When Trump announced 25% tariffs on all imported vehicles and auto parts in March 2025, the stock market delivered its verdict instantly. Major American automakers saw sharp drops in share prices within hours of the announcement. Not Canadian companies, American ones. Because Wall Street understood something that the tariff architects apparently didn't. You cannot separate the US and Canadian auto industries. They are one industry operating across 2 countries. Here's the financial reality. The US-Canada automotive supply chain is so deeply integrated that components for a single vehicle can cross the border multiple times during production. Plants in Michigan depend on Canadian-made parts. Canadian assembly lines depend on American steel and American components. When you tax that movement at 25%, you don't hurt Canada alone. You increase the production cost of every vehicle assembled in America. Those costs don't disappear. They get transferred directly to the American consumer sitting at a dealership. And it's not just cars. Think agriculture. Canada is one of the largest buyers of American farm products: soybeans, corn, wheat, pork. American farmers in the Midwest had built their export models on Canadian demand. When Canada launched $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs, with the credible threat of expanding to $155 billion, American agricultural exporters were staring at a closing door to their most reliable, geographically accessible market. You don't replace Canada with Vietnam overnight. Supply chains don't work that way. Then there's energy. Canada supplies the United States with more oil than any other country on the planet, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq. The pipelines running from Alberta into American refineries process millions of barrels daily. Even Trump understood this was untouchable, which is why Canadian energy received only a 10% tariff instead of 25%. But the signal was sent. Canada began accelerating plans to route that energy toward European and Asian markets instead. Here's the dynamic that American economists are underestimating. Trade wars don't just move goods, they move psychology. And the psychology inside Canada right now represents a long-term structural threat to American exports. When Trump threatened Canadian sovereignty, including floating the idea of Canada becoming the 51st US state, something snapped in the Canadian public consciousness. Canadians didn't just get angry, they organized. Provincial governments launched formal Buy Canadian campaigns. Consumers began actively avoiding American brands. American whiskey disappeared from Ontario government store shelves. Canadian provinces started canceling contracts with American suppliers in government procurement. Mark Carney formalized this by announcing explicit Buy Canadian policies, prioritizing Canadian steel, Canadian lumber, and Canadian materials in all federal government contracts. This is not a temporary protest. This is a government-level rewiring of procurement and consumer behavior. And the economic consequence is direct. Every Canadian dollar that used to flow toward American goods is now being redirected into the Canadian domestic economy or toward new international partners. For American exporters, this is a market that spent decades buying reliably, suddenly switching brands. And unlike a corporate client, you can win back with a better price. National sentiment takes years to reverse. Now let's talk about the thing that makes financial analysts genuinely nervous: the US dollar. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency isn't guaranteed by law. It's maintained by trust, by the belief that global trade will continue to be denominated in dollars, that American financial institutions will remain central to international commerce, and that U.S. trade relationships will remain stable enough to anchor the global system. What happens when a coalition representing 40% of global GDP, the EU plus the 12-nation CPTPP, begins building its own trade architecture, its own investment facilitation frameworks, its own digital trade standards, its own supply chain agreements that deliberately bypass American markets? The answer is that trade increasingly gets settled in euros, in yen, in Australian dollars, not in US dollars. When the EU and CPTPP signed their trade and investment dialogue in November 2025, covering trade diversification, digital commerce, and supply chain resilience, they were quietly building the plumbing for a parallel global trade system, one that doesn't need Wall Street at its center. This is not an overnight shift, but that's exactly what makes it dangerous. It happens gradually, then suddenly. The petrodollar system took decades to build. Its erosion can happen faster than anyone expects when multiple large economies begin coordinating simultaneously. Here's a fact that should make every defense analyst in Washington sit up straight. When the tariff war escalated, Canada announced it was reviewing its contract to purchase American-made F-35 fighter jets. Canada was set to spend billions of dollars on American defense hardware. Carney's government put the contract under formal review, publicly questioning whether American-made equipment was still the best investment for Canadian national security. Think about the message that sends. This is a NATO ally, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, a country that shares the world's longest undefended border with the United States, now openly reconsidering whether it should trust American defense contracts. Carney simultaneously reached out to European defense partners, engaged in discussions about the EU's Rearm Europe plan, and signaled that Canada's military future might look more transatlantic than continental. When a trade war starts bleeding into defense alliances, the financial implications multiply exponentially. Defense contracts represent billions in American manufacturing jobs, in research investment, in industrial capacity. Losing Canada as a defense customer, even partially, sends a signal to every other American ally watching this situation unfold. So here's where we stand. Canada has redirected its trade relationships. A 14-nation coalition is actively constructing a parallel global trade architecture covering 40% of world GDP. American exports face retaliatory tariffs. American auto production costs are climbing. The Buy Canadian movement is structural, not temporary. And now defense contracts are on the table. But there's one final piece, the one that explains why this happened so fast, what the long-term map looks like, and what average Americans can actually do to protect themselves financially from the consequences of a trade war their government started with its most important partner. Welcome back. This is where everything we've built across this video comes together, and where the analysis gets most personal. Because Part 1 showed you the breakup. Part 2 showed you the economic damage already in motion. Part 3 is about where this ends, what the global financial map looks like 5 years from now, what history tells us about nations that start trade wars with their closest partners, and most critically, what everyday Americans should be doing right now to financially position themselves for what's coming. If you've watched this far, you're exactly the kind of person who needs to subscribe. Serious financial analysis, zero noise. Hit that button now. Let's finish this. Before projecting forward, look backward. Because history doesn't repeat exactly. But in economics, it rhymes with remarkable precision. In 1930, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, one of the most catastrophic pieces of economic legislation in American history. Washington raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, convinced it would protect American industry and jobs. What actually happened? America's trading partners retaliated immediately. U.S. exports collapsed by 61% over the following 3 years. The global trading system fractured. Economists widely credit Smoot-Hawley with deepening the Great Depression, turning a severe recession into a decade-long catastrophe. Now here's what's chilling about the parallel. In 1930, America's largest trading partners were also its closest allies. The retaliation came fast. The damage was structural, not temporary. And by the time Washington reversed course, the psychological damage to international trade relationships had already set in. Partners had found alternatives. Supply chains had reorganized. Trust had evaporated. Fast forward to today. The US is once again imposing aggressive tariffs on its closest allies. Canada, its single largest export destination, has declared the old relationship over and begun systematically rebuilding its economic architecture around Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The speed is different this time. In 1930, it took months for the global response to organize. In 2025, Canada had retaliatory tariffs, active within hours. Carney was on a plane to Paris within weeks. And by November 2025, the EU and the 12-nation CPTPP had formally launched their joint trade dialogue in Australia. The world moves faster now, which means the consequences arrive faster too. Here is the financial map of where global trade power is shifting, and every number in this section is documented and real. The CPTPP, the 12-nation Indo-Pacific trade bloc that includes Japan, Australia, Canada, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Mexico, Chile, New Zealand, Peru, Brunei, and the United Kingdom, already represents approximately 14.4% of global GDP and roughly $15.8 trillion in combined economic output. That alone makes it the world's fourth largest free trade area by GDP. The European Union, 27 member economies, represents the world's largest single trading bloc, accounting for close to 16% of global trade on its own. Combined, the EU and CPTPP together represent 32% of global GDP and 37% of global trade. When Canada's proposed integration framework deepens that relationship, which is already formally underway through the Trade and Investment Dialogue launched in November 2025, analysts project the effective economic weight of this coalition climbing toward 40% of global GDP. The United States represents approximately 25% of global GDP. China sits around 18-20%. Do the math. A coordinated EU-CPTPP trade bloc, one specifically designed to build supply chain resilience independent of both American and Chinese pressure, is larger than the U.S. economy. It sets its own digital trade standards, its own environmental trade rules, its own investment frameworks, and Canada, sitting inside CPTPP while also holding a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU through CETA, is positioned at the exact center of this network. Carney wasn't exaggerating when he called Canada the most European of non-European countries. He was making a financial argument. Let's get specific about what this means for people who don't follow trade policy. People who just go to work, pay their bills, and wonder why everything costs more. American consumers are already absorbing higher costs on imported goods because tariffs are a tax, and that tax is paid by the American importer, not the foreign exporter, regardless of what political messaging claims. When Canada retaliates with 25% tariffs on American goods, American exporters lose price competitiveness in the Canadian market. That means fewer sales. Fewer sales means less production. Less production means pressure on wages and employment in export-heavy industries. The American auto sector, concentrated in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, is staring at structurally higher input costs because Canadian auto components now carry tariff penalties in both directions. Studies on integrated supply chains like the US-Canada Automotive Network show that 25% tariffs on integrated production don't reduce imports. They raise domestic production costs. American car buyers pay the difference at the dealership. The average transaction price of a new vehicle was already near record highs before this trade war. Tariff-driven cost escalation pushes it further. American farmers in the soybean belt, the corn corridor, the pork-producing states, they built export projections, assuming Canadian market access remained stable. It no longer does. And Canada's new trade pivot is opening Japanese, Australian, and European agricultural markets to Canadian and other CPTPP suppliers. Suppliers who now compete directly with American farmers for shelf space in markets America is losing access to. Here is what institutional investors and serious financial analysts are monitoring as this situation develops. First, currency diversification. If the EU CPTPP framework deepens and trade between member nations increasingly settles outside the US dollar, dollar demand weakens. That has direct consequences for American purchasing power and inflation. Watch the dollar index over the next 24 months. Second, Canadian asset performance. The Toronto Stock Exchange and Canadian resource equities are attracting fresh international attention as Canada positions itself as a critical mineral supplier, energy exporter, and trade corridor for the new alliance. Investors who understand this rotation early are already positioning. Third, American export sector earnings. Companies with heavy revenue exposure to Canadian and European markets, agricultural processors, auto parts manufacturers, industrial equipment producers, face a genuine headwind. Their earnings guidance over the next 4 to 6 quarters will tell the real story behind the diplomatic language. Fourth, defense sector reallocation. Canada's review of the F-35 contract signals that American defense dominance among allies is no longer automatically assumed. If even one major NATO partner begins diversifying its defense procurement toward European suppliers, the precedent is set for others to follow. Here is the honest conclusion that every finance expert who has studied this situation arrives at, regardless of their political affiliation. The United States had the most valuable trade relationship on Earth, a neighbor that bought more American goods than anyone else, a partner so integrated into American manufacturing that their economies functioned as one, a country that shared intelligence, shared defense infrastructure, shared a border that generated over $2 billion in daily commerce, and Washington tariffed it like an adversary. The response was immediate, coordinated, and strategic, in a way that suggests Canada had been preparing for exactly this scenario, because Carney had spent years at the Bank of England watching how economic coercion reshapes global alliances. He knew what to do the moment it started. Paris first, London second. Then the quiet architecture of a 40% of GDP coalition built while the news cycle was still focused on the initial tariff announcements. History will record this as the moment America's closest ally stopped waiting for Washington to be a reliable partner and started building a world that didn't need it to be. Whether that world ends up better or worse for American workers, American farmers, and American consumers depends entirely on what Washington does next. And right now, the answer to that question is not encouraging. That is the full picture. 3 parts. Documented facts. Real financial consequences. No spin. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, subscribe right now. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening to the global economy. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story is not finished. The EU CPTPP dialogue is ongoing. Canada's trade pivot is accelerating, and every development that comes out of Ottawa, Brussels, or Tokyo in the next 12 months connects directly back to what we've laid out here today. Stay informed, stay positioned, and we'll see you in the next one.